It's just women of all age groups, any position in life, whether they want to be pregnant, can be pregnant, can't be, it doesn't matter. They are so impacted by these abortion laws and the consequences, like this very wide consequences that they have.
Reproductive health is a form of is a unity, and reproductive freedom is a unity. And doctors who specialize in reproduction need to be able to make decisions, just like women need to be able to make decisions about when to support childbirth and when to end it.
It's been 3 years since Roe v. Wade was overturned and the Supreme Court removed the federal constitutional protection for abortion and returned the issue to the states. And throughout these times, many states have passed anti-abortion laws. And we have been able to see during this time how draconian abortion restrictions are and how horrifically they impact women. So in today's episode, we will be providing our listeners with an update on some of the ways that abortion bans are affecting women in the United States. Welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute Podcast. I'm Agustina Vergara, and I'm an associate fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. And with me is Ben Bayer, a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute.
Hi, Agustina.
So, Ben, I would like to begin by discussing something that's very important to clarify from the get-go. I think that as a consequence of many people mistakenly lumping together Ayn Rand with conservatives, they think that Ayn Rand must have been opposed to abortion. Just like her view on every single issue is distinctive from conservatives and from the liberals as well, her view on abortion is also distinctive from the view that the conservatives have. So it's important to, I think, set the record straight once again. Ayn Rand was in favor of the right to an abortion. She had distinctive reasons, again, not the same reasons as the liberals, but she was in favor to the right for an abortion for women. So, Ben, I'm going to let you're an expert on this topic, and I'm going to let you expand on that, but just very high-level summary of the position, so to speak. Rand considers that rights begin at birth, not at conception. And an embryo is only a potential human being, is not an actual human being who has individual rights, because individual rights only appear once a child is born and can exist independently from the women, right? So neither an embryo or a fetus have any rights. The actual human being who does have rights is the woman that is carrying a pregnancy. She has a right to her own life. And we're not talking here just merely survival, which of course she does have a right to her own survival, but a right to own her life and live her life in her own terms, live like a human being. So she does have the right to control her own body and to decide whether to carry a pregnancy to term or not. And Rand considered that forcing her to sacrifice her values, her health, and her future potentially to carry out a pregnancy is anti-life, actually, in the deepest possible sense, because Rand understood that being a human is not mere, like I said, it's not mere survival. We're not here just to reproduce. We're here to live as human beings, right? And to live our life to the fullest extent possible. And this is very distinctive from the typical, most of the, typical liberal positions on abortion, because the typical position is mostly rooted in rights to privacy, such as was Roe, equality and public health and whatnot. But objectivism bases it on actual individual rights. And this is part of the reason why objectivism also objects to government subsidies and to guaranteed access to abortion, because we consider that a woman has a right to an abortion if she considers that that is the best choice for her, but others shouldn't be forced to pay for that abortion. So that is another way in which we are distinctive from the typical positions on abortion. So Ben, like I said, you're an expert on this topic. You have written extensively about this, about Rand's position on abortion. What are other important and distinctive aspects of her view that we might want to share with our listeners?
Yes, so you mentioned that I've written on it, and that we have a book that we've released, Why the Right to Abortion is Sacrosanct. We released a second edition of it at the Institute in January. And in the second edition, the expanded edition, there's a new lengthy theoretical essay where I really dig into why this position of Ayn Rand's is not just some accidental quirk of her personality that she happened to add on to the other things philosophical that she said. No, in fact, it is a position that is intimately connected to her philosophy. It flows systematically from all of the essential elements of her philosophy. And I really don't think you can understand the philosophy or its position on individual freedom unless you understand her position on abortion. And so just think about it from this perspective. Suppose that you want to defend a businessman's right to profit, to be able to practice economic freedom, free from interference by socialist force, used for the sake of redistribution or what have you. Well, you can only make that case for why the businessman should be free to do that if you think his life is his own. He has the right to pursue his own life. And as you say, Agustina, that is more than just mere physical survival, because, of course, protecting people's, right to an empty stomach is what the socialists are always talking about. So what makes capitalism distinctive is that, no, it's the right to be free from force in order to pursue your long-term flourishing happiness. That's why you need to be free to think, you need to be free to produce, to trade, to profit. All of these are necessary for a human being's long-term happiness. That's what the right to the pursuit of happiness means. And so that's the value that's at stake when you're trying to defend capitalism. Well, then, but by the same token, what matters when it comes to abortion rights is the woman's right to the same thing. It's not just her right to not be killed. It's her right to the pursuit of happiness. That's what the right to life ultimately means, according to Ayn Rand. And so if you care about what the real right to life is, it's something that applies primarily to the woman in this kind of case. And by the same token, an embryo is not capable of any kind of long-range action. It can't even act. It's not the sort of thing, in Ayn Rand's view of individual rights, that can even have individual rights. The concept just doesn't apply to it. The way I often put it is the paradigm case of a rights bearer is a mature adult. That doesn't mean only mature adults have rights. You can extend rights to infants too, as far back as infancy, but you can't extend it as far back to before birth, where once you begin to grant those rights, once you begin to think of those of the fetus or the embryo as having rights, well, then to protect them, you'd have to interfere with the rights of someone who's actually one of these paradigm rights bearers, which is, of course, to say the woman. So that's just an example of how this position on abortion flows from her essential understanding of individual rights. That's a point about her political philosophy. But I mean, you could say the same thing for every other element of her philosophy. All of that holds unless you hold it on faith that rights instead come from God for inexplicable reasons. Of course, Ayn Rand says, no, you don't go by faith, you go by reason. And from the perspective of reason, there's no reason to think that's where rights come from, or that kind of being exists. Likewise, you could hold all that unless you think instead that the woman has some kind of selfless duty to sacrifice for the sake of the unborn. But again, here it's essential to Ayn Rand's philosophy that there's a virtue in selfishness, that selfless sacrifice is irrational and immoral. And so you can't understand Ayn Rand's philosophy unless you take a close look at her position on abortion. All of the essential elements of her philosophy are contained in that position. So, Augustine, let's look to the current day and what the situation with regards to reproductive freedom is in the United States today, especially now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned. We've had a few years. We've been commenting on this all along, but we haven't talked about this in about 6 months. So what's the latest that we can say about how these bans are impacting women's pursuit of happiness?
Well, there's a lot going on, and not positive, unfortunately. But I think part of what we're going to discuss today is like see concretely how horrific these abortion bans are and the effect that they have on the woman's right to life, and understanding the women's right to life not only as survival, but also as survival, but like to live as a human being with, ambitions and wanting to do what's best for her own body and her own life. So one of the phenomena that we have been seeing in the last few years since Roe was overturned is that there's this article from the Wall Street Journal from July 6th. It's titled "How Abortion Bans Are Affecting Where Women Live and Work." And this article discusses that abortion bans in certain states are prompting women to move to other states where their right to an abortion may be recognized. And I want to quote from the article. It says, at one point, the article quotes an economist that discusses that a single policy change is unlikely to be the marginal factor in deciding on a move. And yet, here we have this really strong new evidence that abortion policy really is impacting migration. And when I read this, I thought, to me, it was like, oh, duh. This is being talked as a policy issue, right? But this, quote, single policy issue is literally a matter of life or death. It can be both physical death, because abortion bans also ban, in many cases, access to reproductive care and life-saving care that a pregnant woman may need, and also living the life you want to live, like we were just discussing, on your own terms, which is the actual abortions. And to me, it was like, this was sort of discussed like, oh, this is just one more policy. But this is not gonna be the income tax or rent control, like this sort of policy, which in my opinion shouldn't exist either. But abortion is directly related to the actual survival of a woman and her capacity to live like a human being and to be able to pursue the life that she wants to live, right? And I think in a lot of discussions about abortion, because they're informed by other philosophical premises, this is, I think, lost. And it kind of like makes me upset and mad that it does, because, I am one of these women who is of childbearing age, who is rethinking or like making decisions about where to live and where to go based on the fact on whether my rights are going to be respected where I want to go. So to me personally, I just don't think, I won't be able to get an abortion in Texas, I'm not going to move there, or anywhere else. Like, that wouldn't be necessarily my proclivity right now, but it is, I won't be able to get life-saving care if I become pregnant and I have a complication, even if it's a wanted pregnancy. So to me, the way I think about it is the bare minimum I require from a government is that it will respect my basic right to live, to remain alive, and to, get the appropriate medical care that I need. So I think that abortion bans really treat my life as disposable, as completely insignificant, and treats me as if it's okay to sacrifice me for the religious dogma, essentially, of these laws, right? And the legislators that enacted these laws. And to me, honestly, as someone who is impacted by these laws, because I am a woman of childbearing age, I find this absolutely repulsive, and I find it extremely offensive. And it's no surprise, I think, that other women like me are leaving these states, or that are rethinking or reconsidering whether to move there or not, because it's just a matter of, does the government of the state recognize you as a human being with full rights, and that your life is you can live your life, or are they going to sacrifice you in the altar of these religious laws against abortion?
Yes, I also saw the Wall Street Journal article that you saw. It's eye-opening. I think it's important that the Journal, of all places, ran it right around July 4th. And it lays out an array of evidence, I think of different quality evidence, some of it more persuasive than others, but what it's pointing to is undeniably real. So one of the data points they mention is a study done by the National Bureau of Economic Research, which estimated that something like 146,000 residents have moved states because of abortion bans. Now, that number's somewhat speculative. They're using computer modeling based on observed outflows from states and how they correlated just in time with the imposition of these various abortion bans. But like it's undeniable that some chunk of that is for the reason that they mention. There are people who say that's their reason. There are polling numbers indicating that. And while there are other explanations that could account for it, especially since the Sunbelt state population is still growing, like there's also they also cite a survey of how higher achieving women have been applying to fewer universities in states with abortion bans, something a lot easier to quantify. That tells you something about at least why they're not moving to these states, even if they're not necessarily moving out of them, and some of them certainly are. So there's a real factor here at work. I think it's likely to increase. And that's especially true given one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit later, which is the even more quantifiable impact these bans have had on healthcare providers, particularly reproductive healthcare providers. And, if they're leaving the state, the people who need them are certainly not going to want to live there, won't move there, will leave if the doctors they need are leaving as well.
Yes, Ben, and also it's not quote, just an abortion, which is an important thing, but it's also, like I said, these bans really impact the way that women get care when they are pregnant, whether they want to carry out their pregnancy or not. I had been reading about these medical emergency exceptions that are built into abortion laws, and I was reading that it's a nightmare for both the doctors and the patients. And I think it has an impact on what you were mentioning, how this is really making things really difficult for doctors as well. Because with these medical emergency provisions in these exceptions in these abortion laws, these exceptions force clinicians to kind of like guess how sick a patient has to be before they can act and intervene, for instance, and provide an abortion to save the health or the life of the women. So essentially, in an emergency situation, doctors have to figure this out while a patient's conditions worsens and can worsen really quickly, and they have to do all this thinking and figure out because they may be facing felony charges or the loss of their medical license if they make a mistake and they act outside of the bounds of the law. And I was reading some guidelines from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. They have like a whole page dedicated to explaining roughly how to navigate these exceptions. And it explains that these regulations make the job of the doctors incredibly difficult and that they are unscientific. And they state that, and I quote, "There is no one-size-fits-all law that can take every individual, family, or medical condition into account, making legislative interference in the practice of medicine incredibly dangerous." So when they say incredibly dangerous, that what it actually means is people will literally die. Women will die or will be gravely hurt or perhaps, permanently hurt due to these laws, which are totally, apparently, from what I read, like unscientific. And of course, no law can possibly, typify every single exception because every medical situation is going to be extremely different because every patient is extremely different, including because they may have pre-existing conditions that may be aggravated by the pregnancy and basically infinite numbers of issues that the law cannot possibly typify. And the doctors are in this situation where they don't know if they're technically breaking the law and possibly facing felony charges for trying to save the life or the health of their patients. And so this happens in all sorts of situations. There's these bans impact what a doctor does during miscarriages, ectopic pregnancies, if the fetus has some sort of anomaly or a condition that is incurable. And I was reading and watching some of, there was a 60 Minutes episode from, I think it was June, from this, a doctor who became pregnant, and it was a wanted pregnancy, but during her pregnancy, she discovered that the fetus had many issues. And this woman says that the brain of the fetus was not formed correctly. It had only one kidney. The spine was bent, that it would put pressure on the heart. And she was told by doctors that it was actually a lethal condition. So this planned pregnancy that she actually wanted to carry out to term was not going to happen. Like, this fetus was actually going to die. And the journalist asks her, this woman, she says, "What did you do?" And she responds, "I screamed, I cried, I got a second opinion, I got a third opinion." And it wasn't a question as to what we were going to do. It was a question of how we were going to do it without getting arrested. So this happened in Texas under a law that was before Roe was overturned, a Texas law that banned abortion at 6 weeks with no provisions for victims of rape, incest, or severe fetal abnormalities, like the case of these women. And I think that this was pre-Roe, but this is exactly the type of legislations that states are able to pass because the federal protection of abortion was overturned. And this bill, in the case of these women, included an exception for medical emergencies, but it didn't define what those were, right? So the doctors didn't know what to do because, like I said, every case is extremely difficult. It's extremely unique, and there is no way that a law can typify when you are committing a crime to care while you're caring for your patient or you're not, right? So essentially, this woman had to end up, she got in touch with her mom, and her mom booked an abortion in New Mexico, booked the tickets, put everything on her card, and gave her daughter cash, like an envelope full of cash, to go pay for the abortion in cash, so there wouldn't be any paper trail to show that she had gotten an abortion. So imagine being treated like the worst type of criminal for wanting to save your life and avoid more suffering for yourself. This is happening all across the country because of these abortion bans. And I just don't. I think people need to hear more of these stories, because what is being done to women is absolutely horrific, and it's exactly what Rand said. Like, this is anti-life, and it's happening. It's not just punishing women who are seeking an abortion because they want to live life in their own terms, but it's also punishing women who actually want to carry out their pregnancies. But it happens that you have a miscarriage, or you have your fetus is not gonna develop, and you need to get an abortion and you can't. So it's punishing women all around.
Yeah, and if the stories don't move you, maybe the numbers will. The story you mentioned just now, Agustina, is one that happened before Roe was overturned. Since Roe was overturned, in Texas, for example, you have something now even much worse than SB 8, which banned it at 6 weeks. You have basically a complete abortion ban from conception, with nominal exception for the life of the mother, which I'll say more about in a minute. But because we now have basically across-the-board abortion ban here in Texas, the numbers are measurable. You can measure the differences. And ProPublica came out with a study just a few weeks ago, July 1st, where they took stock of the results, how since August 2022, when they started taking numbers post-Roe, the number of miscarriages requiring blood transfusions in the ER for first-term miscarriages increased by 54%. Now, what that's a sign of is that they are waiting longer. It doesn't mean that those miscarriages necessarily don't result in an abortion, but it means that because they're having to wait longer before they decide to have an abortion, that they are taking much bigger risks with the woman's life. Because if you get to the point where you're having to give them a blood transfusion, you're in much more dangerous territory. Incidentally, the number of ER visits for first trimester miscarriages also increased by about 25%, which is not accounted for simply by the increase in the number of births. It's a vastly disproportionate, the number of increase in births since August 2022. These are all signs that they're just waiting longer and therefore endangering the lives of these women more. Likewise, the rate of sepsis has increased by 50%. That's the same condition that Amanda Zurawski suffered. If you know Amanda Zurawski, she's become a major activist in favor of abortion rights, opposition to Texas's laws, because what happened to her in 2022 is very similar to the story you told earlier. She was 18 weeks pregnant. She very much intended to have a baby, but there was a complication in pregnancy where they knew the child was not going to survive. She was not going to give birth. She needed an abortion, but at this point, Roe's been overturned. Her doctors are very uncertain about what they can do, and so they end up making her wait and wait and wait as well, to the point where she goes septic, and now she's infertile because they waited so long. And as a result, she sued the state of Texas along with a number of other women who were in similar situations. And it's true that, yeah, if you are comfortable with taking really big risks with your life, you might be okay in Texas and other states like this, where these really draconian bans have been imposed. You might have to wait longer. You might still make it. You might be okay in the end, but you might also end up like Amanda Zurawski, and you might end up infertile and not able to have children because of it. In some cases, you might end up dead. So childbearing is hard enough and stressful and physically challenging enough all by itself. Is it something we should also add a game of Russian roulette to? I really don't think so. And of course, it's true that just this past May in Texas, a new law was passed, and it was a bipartisan effort by Republicans and rather reluctant Democrats to clarify the life of the mother exception that was included in the earlier Texas ban, because these stories like Amanda Zurawski's had come up. Because they wanted to try to stop some of these horror stories. Well, I took a look at the text of the new law, and it's, maybe a certain tiny little step forward, but doesn't provide much more than cold comfort for women and for doctors. It doesn't change the definition of what counts as an emergency that warrants the exception. It's still the same as it was before, that it places the female at the risk of death or poses a serious risk of substantial impairment of bodily function. It's the same as it was before. All that it says that's new is really, well, it names a few really obvious concrete conditions that should be grounds for exception, like ectopic pregnancy, stillborn fetuses, et cetera, which you'd figure they'd have known anyway beforehand. But then otherwise says, well, a doctor has to use their best medical judgment. Well, that's what's really cold comfort, because these doctors are trying to use their best judgment, have been doing it all along, even before this exception. Still, they're paralyzed because, well, you're talking about a 99-year jail sentence and potential loss of their license if they mess up. The law also says, well, the woman doesn't need to be in imminent danger to get an abortion, so she doesn't have to be right about to die. Thanks for that. But it doesn't say what does justify the abortion. There's no new positive criterion that says when it's safe, aside from, well, use your best judgment, doc. Amanda Zurawski said this is very, 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 very tiny step forward. I mean, she's perhaps being a little too optimistic there. If you're a doctor and 99 years of your freedom and your license are on the line, this is not much more reassurance. So I don't see too much hope in that particular clarification of the exception.
Yes, like I said, Ben, these you can't possibly come up with an exception that is going to be good for every patient and it's going to be clear and objective, because this is not an issue that is an object of a valid object of regulation. You cannot regulate what healthcare people should get and what not, and how a doctor should treat a patient. It's something that you just cannot do, and it shouldn't be done in this or any case, but especially this.
Yeah, and you might think that if it's all these restrictions on the miscarriages and doctor's own judgment are bad enough, but there we're talking about the doctor losing their license. What kind of consequences can mothers or women themselves face? And what we've also seen recently is a whole host of pregnancy-related prosecutions of women themselves.
Yeah, and this is partly the issue of women that are being prosecuted because of miscarriages, which I'll say, I mean, everything about these abortion bans and the way they treat us women is just extremely outrageous to me. But the issue of a miscarriage, and when I was reading about these cases and I knew about some of them before, I thankfully have never had to experience a miscarriage, but I know many women who have. The devastation that so many women feel when they were seeking a pregnancy and they wanted to have a child and they have a miscarriage is nothing short of absolutely brutal. It's a trauma that I know personally, women who years later are carrying that trauma with them, and it depends on each one and it depends on the circumstances and all of that, but it's something that is absolutely devastating for a woman who wanted to carry a pregnancy to term. And you have to be such a hideous monster to punish a woman, especially for anything related to her reproductive health, but for having a miscarriage, like, you have to be such a horrible anti-life monster to do that to a woman. But let's explore some of those cases, Ben.
Yeah, because someone's going to be thinking, well, none of these laws are supposed to punish women for their miscarriages. And yet, if you look at the numbers, there's good reason to think that may be exactly what's happening. So the organization Pregnancy Justice released a report in September 2024. This is an organization that has for a long time tracked what they call pregnancy-related prosecutions. And they've tracked over 1,800 such cases since 1973. So obviously this is something that it's a phenomenon that long precedes the overturn of Roe. But what they noticed was that when these various abortion bans went into effect in 2022, the number of pregnancy-related prosecutions went up. That in 2022 itself, that there were 210, which was the largest ever. I think it was the year, not just 2022, but 2022 to 2023, the first year after Roe, largest single year in terms of the records they kept on a per year basis. There was 104 of them in Alabama alone. Now, what are these cases? It's a whole range of different cases. It includes miscarriages that were alleged to have been caused by substance abuse, and that's actually the majority of them. But what they notice is that since these laws went into effect, prosecutors seem to be more likely and more willing to prosecute on the assumption that, well, I guess we don't think that women have the right to an abortion anymore. Fetuses, embryos are seen as having rights, therefore as potential crime victims. And so even if it's not an abortion that the woman is being charged with, there's just a greater impetus to charge her for all kinds of other crimes where there's no even reason to think that it's what she wanted. There are 5 of these cases where it was alleged that what the woman was secretly trying to do was an abortion. But again, remember, we're always reminded, or it's always insisted, that the laws are not there to punish women; they're there to punish providers, etc. And in fact, even in these 5 cases, usually what happens is the woman is charged with something else, like abuse of a corpse or infanticide. And notably, none of the charges have ever stuck. But the point of the example is that with the passage of these laws, it really looks like there's just a greater will, greater impetus, more people who have the intention of charging women who've lost their children with some crime or other, which is, in their minds at least, interchangeable with attempted abortion. This is clearly what seems to have happened in the most recent and best publicized case like this, which was Brittany Watts in Ohio in September 2023. Here again is a case of a woman who wanted to have a child, who went to the hospital because something was wrong with her pregnancy. She was refused nobody wanted to take a close look at it. She was not given an abortion, which might otherwise have been indicated. As a result, she went home. She had a miscarriage at home. And then because of the fact that she had the miscarriage at home, she was accused of trying to have an abortion. She was charged with abuse of a corpse. Eventually, the charges were dismissed, but she had to go through a whole nightmare because of this, even when she had attempted to seek care and had attempted to have it taken care of in a proper way at the hospital. And the person who called her was a nurse at the hospital who suspected her of really just wanting to get rid of it, all without grounds, all without evidence. So this is, like you say, Agustina, suffering a miscarriage is already a tremendously traumatic event, and here we have. Now, it's not enough that the woman lived through just the pain of that in the first place. Now she's even in some of these cases being prosecuted with abuse of a corpse, adding dramatic insult to injury.
Yeah, it's a level of evil that is really hard to fathom. Like, it's just incredible that in a place like the United States of America, of all places on earth, this is happening. And this is... like we said, some of these things predate the overturn of Roe, but now because Roe was overturned, they're going to be happening more and more, and they are happening, as we've been discussing, more and more. But yeah, like, and that nurse, like the nurse reported her, like that is just absolutely disgusting. Like, but that is not the case that all doctors are like that. I think the vast majority, I would say, of doctors are. They want to do good by their patients, and they are really concerned about, these limits and these threats that are, that are in front of them because of these abortion laws. So let's discuss a little bit, Ben, about kind of like that side of the equation, the doctors that are not able to provide the care that their patients need.
Yeah, and to some extent, you already talked about this more with focus on what the impact on that is for the patients. But we should say a good amount also about what it means for doctors, which then has further impacts on the patients. So there was a survey taken by Manet Health Strategies in October 2024, basically just surveying OBGYN providers state by state. And so, for example, in Texas, it was determined that 76% of doctors, OBGYN doctors, believe they can't engage in best practices. That is, they can't use their best judgment about what is medically necessary because of these laws. In part, that's because 60% of the same group surveyed fears that they will suffer some kind of legal repercussion because of the decisions they make. Now, that was made before the latest tweak to the law. I'd be surprised if the survey results change much after the law, but just to note some of the consequences of their believing they can't make their best decision. 13% say they are planning to retire early. 2% are leaving the state. 4% are leaving obstetrics. 3% are leaving medicine entirely. 21% are thinking about or planning to leave the state, even if they haven't planned to do it yet. 14% would like to leave the state, but can't because of personal reasons, family obligations, or because they feel like they have an obligation to stay and help women when others have to leave. Also about Texas in particular, Texas, of course, has a good number of universities. In fact, it's responsible for training. It's the one with the second highest rate of training OBGYNs at medical facilities like Rice and Baylor. And yet now, because of these laws, you have fewer people applying to residencies in medical schools in Texas. Residency is usually where you get your most important medical training, certainly for something like reproductive health care. There were 14,000 fewer applications generally for medical residencies in Texas. There was a 16% decline in applications for OBGYN residencies in 2024. So there's going to be fewer OBGYNs in Texas as a result of this. Usually when someone gets a residency in a state, that's where they end up staying to practice. And so when the same organization, Manet Health, runs the numbers, they project that the number of OBGYNs is expected to not grow nearly enough to cover the growth in population that you're otherwise seeing in Texas. And so in the year 2030, where they estimate Texas is going to need about 5,000 OBGYN physicians, where Texas is only going to have about 4,200. And so there's going to be a shortage of them. And this is part of the reason I was saying before, like if people aren't reluctant to move here now or aren't leaving here now, they're going to be more reluctant in about 5 years when there aren't enough actually trained medical professionals to handle pregnancy care. Another thing to add is that typically it's in an OBGYN medical residency where you're going to learn how to do abortion. And so you might think, well, yes, of course they're not going to learn abortion. That's a whole part of the plan. Well, then that raises the question, which is how are doctors going to be able to do the medically necessary abortions that these laws are supposed to allow for exceptions for? So even if you allow for the law, for that kind of exception with the law, you're going to have fewer and fewer people who are going to be able to provide for it, just because nobody wants to come here to learn how to do it. Nobody wants to come here to practice. And so where are these, even the ones that are supposed to be legal, where are they going to come from?
Yeah, and it's worth also saying that, of course, reproductive healthcare for women and gynecological care for women, it's not just circumscribed to the years where they can carry a child. It's also, menopausal women, postmenopausal women will not be able to get the care that they need, even completely unrelated to a pregnancy, because they're just not going to be enough gynecologists to be able to provide that service. So really, if you think about it, it's just women of all age groups, all, any position in life, whether they want to be pregnant, can't be, it doesn't matter. They're just going to be so impacted, and they are so impacted by these abortion laws and the consequences, like this very wide consequences that they have. And so when I was watching this 60 Minutes episode that I had mentioned before, they also interviewed a doctor who describes as, quote, dangerous to even have a conversation with her patients about life-saving reproductive care. So she says, and I quote, 5 years ago, I could counsel a patient on all the various treatment options available in these medically complex situations. And now it is a dangerous situation for me to have that comprehensive conversation with my patients, because I personally, as a family physician, could face losing my license. I could face life in prison. I could face huge fines just for having a conversation with my patients about evidence-based care. So doctors are put in a position where they risk their own livelihoods and their own freedom to be able to do their job and to provide the best possible care and advice to the patients. We're not just talking, they performed an abortion, or they just having a conversation with their patients about what the possible best care is going to be for them. The job of a doctor is to provide the best science-based care for their patients. But in these states that ban abortion, if they do that and that science-based care entails suggesting an abortion, they are like, if they have that conversation, they risk losing it all, essentially, their license, their livelihoods, their freedom, perhaps. So essentially, they are being punished for trying to do what's best for their patient. And I think it's hard to conceive of anything more twisted and evil than doing this to doctors. And the fact that you go into your OB or your gynecologist's office and you sit there and you know that your doctor cannot legally give you the best possible advice. Like me as a woman, that would be absolutely devastating for me to know that. Or, to have essentially a lawyer in the room, sometimes I think probably somewhat literally, but also maybe just figuratively, to know, because my doctor cannot possibly know when they are breaking the law by giving me advice or not. That is just absolutely appalling that is happening in these states.
Yeah, and since this is the Ayn Rand Institute podcast, it's maybe worth drawing the following parallel, which is that this is exactly like what happens in Atlas Shrugged. You know, of course, the premise of it is what happens in a world where the great creators, the great producers, the great thinkers, the great innovators go on strike, where the atlases of the world, on whom the shoulders of whom the world rests, what happens when they decide to shrug? Well, I mean, if you think about it, each and every one of us whose mother didn't use a midwife, our lives came from an OBGYN doctor. So like they literally are the ones responsible for many of our births. And so they play a rather important role in human life. Arguably, they are atlases, and they're atlases who train and put in years and if not decades in order to get to the level of expertise and knowledge where they are qualified to do that. But what these laws are basically telling them is, yeah, we don't want you. We don't want you to be able to use your best judgment to provide the best care that you've trained in order to provide. And so, well, what happens from what do we know from Atlas Shrugged? When someone is put in that position, they're thinking, you don't want us, huh? You don't want the care that you depend on, the care that you and your loved ones depend on. You also want to throttle our minds with force. Well, if you don't want this kind of quote unquote evil, I guess we're just going to stop being evil. And we're going to stop coming to your state. We're going to leave your state, and you can just be left to fend for yourself and see what kind of primitive conditions you're going to be left with as a result of that. I don't know how a state like Texas, that otherwise is trying to bill itself and in certain ways embodying the kind of American entrepreneurial lifestyles, trying to become a new economy kind of state, tech economy. I don't know how they expect to be able to sustain that kind of growth if at the same time it's not safe to come here and actually raise a family, because there aren't going to be as many, or even any someday, who knows, OBGYNs so that people can have children. And I also want to stress, it is not just about the women who want to have children and who need reproductive care in order to make that happen. It is also obviously about the women who just don't want to have children, either because it's not the right time in their life, they need to wait until their life is more, their career is more sustainable, or just because having children doesn't play a role in their life plans at all. Obviously, they have a right to do it as well. They have a right to not have children if they don't want to. Abortion is a way of making sure that happens. It doesn't violate anyone's rights for them to use it. And if it just so happened that because a bunch of theocratic statists who think that a sub-entity, the embryo, has rights, because of that they are saying we need to restrict people from having abortions, it's rather poetic justice that by trying to stop women who don't want to have children, you end up also making things harder for those who do. And that's exactly what's happening. And it's not an accident, because reproductive health is a unity, and reproductive freedom is a unity. And doctors who specialize in reproduction need to be able to make decisions, just like women need to be able to make decisions about when to have when to support childbirth and when to end it. And so when you target the atlases that make reproductive health care possible, you are also thereby, of course, hurting the women who need that health care, whether they want to have a child or not.
Yes, Ben, I think it bears repeating that it's just punishing doctors for doing what's best for their patient, which is literally their job, is just a level of evil that it's hard to conceive. But let's also discuss, Ben, because not all is horrible. I mean, a lot of these things are just truly horrific, but there are some silver linings, and there are other things that are going on that are kind of like pushing back against some of these laws and this mentality behind abortion restrictions.
Yeah, and I think the reason to end with what you might call silver linings is not just because we're Pollyannas who think, oh yeah, everything's always going to be okay, because sometimes it isn't. It's because the silver linings show that it's possible to change. It's the silver linings show things don't have to be horrible. People can make better choices if they are if they are brought to reason. And so here are a few things I've noticed in the past 6 months or so that are worth flagging. One is that the Supreme Court blocked attempts to force the FDA to certify mifepristone, which is one of the major abortion drugs, and the Trump administration has asked such lawsuits by states to be dismissed. So it looks like, at least for the foreseeable future, we're still going to be able to have medication abortion by mail. There are, of course, many other cases in the courts where that could turn out differently, but at least for the time being, there is that lifeline that women in some of these states with abortion bans, at least for the time being, have. And it'll be interesting to see how those different cases shake out. It's something I'm sure we'll come back to talking about on this program. In early July, the Wisconsin Supreme Court overturned that state's 1849 ban on abortion. As some of you may know, this was a point of contention in the race for the one of the positions on that Supreme Court in recent months. I took a look at that decision. I think it's an okay decision. It could be a lot stronger, but it's about probably as good as they can get in Wisconsin right now. What they argued was that post Roe in the 1980s and 1990s in Wisconsin, various laws had been passed regulating abortion, saying when abortion could happen, and they argued that those laws implied the overturn of the 1849 ban, and that's why the state should see that ban as overturned, even if Roe is no longer applicable. So that's an okay decision. It would have been stronger, I think, if they had said something about how basic liberties in the Wisconsin Constitution guaranteed a right to abortion, just like, in fact, the right to liberty does, which I think was the core idea behind Roe, which was right. But we'll take what we can get, at least in Wisconsin. In places where there is no longer recourse through the courts, you do have the option of overturning abortion bans using referenda and ballot measures. And just recently in Idaho, where there is a ban on abortion, citizens approved a ballot measure that they would then get to vote on with the potential of then overturning that state's current ban. And that's always an optimistic thing to happen, because in several different red states now where there were abortion bans on the books, where they were able to vote on it, where there was a referendum, states like Kansas and Ohio, even though they're red states, even though they're heavily Republican states, when put to a vote, Republicans even were willing to vote to overturn the abortion bans. And I think that would happen probably in most red states in this country if they were able to have a vote on it. It certainly would happen in Texas. It's not going to happen in Texas, unfortunately, because it's very hard to put ballot measures up for vote in this state, but apparently not in Idaho, so good for Idaho. We talked about how some of those women were prosecuted because of their miscarriages. As far as I can tell, to the extent I've followed all of them, none ended up actually being charged. None of them were convicted, so the charges were basically dismissed. I think people don't have the stomach for that, and that's at least a good sign that there's a point to which they will not go. By the same token, in all of the state houses where various personhood bills were being pushed, and personhood bills would treat basically an embryo as a equivalent to all other citizens in the eyes of the law, and therefore arguably could punish women as murderers, to the contrary of the intent of the existing abortion bans. That's probably why a lot of these personhood bills have failed, because most people are unwilling to go that far, which at least is a good result that these personhood bills have been banned. And the thing that I'll close on here is the theme that I sound in a piece we just released this week or last week at ARI on precisely those issues, because what's happened in those cases where women haven't been prosecuted for their miscarriages, where personhood bills haven't been passed because they don't want to see women as murderers, they only want to punish the doctors, is you've had the kind of anti-abortion moderates come out to say, no, that's going too far, we don't want to punish women. And like I said, I think that's a good outcome. But the interesting thing to observe about it is that as good as the outcome is, or at least it's not as bad as it could have been, what I think it points to is a really deep inconsistency in the intellectual position of the anti-abortion movement, in the position of these so-called moderates. Because if you really thought that an embryo from conception had rights, uh, you wouldn't try to have these kinds of exceptions. That moderate position would just be fully inconsistent. Why wouldn't you try to punish a woman as a murderer if she's the one who's actually asked the doctor to perform the abortion? Just like you normally will prosecute somebody who hires a hitman to do their murdering for them. So there's just no intellectually justifiable position where you can argue that, yeah, the embryo has rights, but the woman isn't a murderer. So something else is driving that kind of position. You have a hard time seeing how could they really think it's murder. And like the same question comes up with various bills in states about IVF, right? Because IVF always involves the destruction of fertilized embryos. If they really have rights, why wouldn't it count as murder? That is, why wouldn't IVF count as murder? And what I argue, is that a lot of these people who are opposed to abortion can't really think that it's murder, that the idea that it's murder is really just a rationalization for something else. Something else is really driving opposition to abortion. And what I argue is that it is a kind of puritanical view about sex, that it's the opposition to the idea that we should be able to be in control of our own reproductive faculties, that we should be able to have sex as an end in itself, because sexual joy is an end in itself. They think sex can only be a means to the end of reproduction. And so, well, it makes sense why they would be okay with IVF then, right? Because it doesn't actually involve sex. It's just about reproduction, even though it involves destroying fertilized embryos, the thing that you shouldn't be able to do if you thought that destroying a fertilized embryo is murder. And so while there's a silver lining in the fact that these personhood bills have failed, it means the outcome is not as bad as it could be. What I think is that it points to the fact that there is still a very dark motive involved, even in the alleged moderates in their opposition to abortion. They aren't just innocently deluded into thinking that the embryo is a human being with rights. They have a very vicious anti-happiness, anti-life motive. And so this whole movement is coming from a bad and vicious place.
And completely anti-human life perspective. So with that, Ben, let's draw a line here. But before we do, I want to recommend some resources that our audience may want to look at to learn more about abortion. And particularly, I would like to first of all point our audience to Ayn Rand's own words about abortion. In the Ayn Rand lexicon, if you go to courses.aynrand.org/lexicon, you can find the very first entry there is on abortion, and you can read some excerpts of some of what Rand has said about abortion, and you can be linked then to the full sources and the essays where she expands on those ideas. Then we have Ben's book, Why the Right to Abortion is Sacrosanct. We released an expanded edition earlier this year, so go check that out. It's very comprehensive, a very comprehensive view of abortion from the objectivist perspective. And then the article that Ben just mentioned, it's called "The Dark Form of Control Even Anti-Abortion Moderates Want," which we published on our journal New Ideal on July 23rd. Okay, so with that, please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, and if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, comment as well. And you can also send us comments privately or questions to newideal@aynrand.org. All right, thank you, Ben, for this discussion, and thank you to our audience. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Agustina.